Secretary Esper, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Christiane. Good to be here.
Can you tell us first and foremost, there seems to be some confusion that maybe you can clear up. Where are the U.S. forces in Syria going? The president has said perhaps a contingent could stay in Syria. You said that they were going to be redeployed to western Iraq. But the latest news is that the Iraqi command says, welcome to come across the border, but only en route out. He doesn't anticipate your troops staying there. So where will they be?
Well, as you know, we're conducting a phased withdrawal, deliberate phased withdrawal from northeast Syria. It began with what we call phase 1, which was in the immediate zone of attack. Now we're under phase 2, which is from the northeast quarter, if you will. And then eventually we'll have other phases that will draw all the forces out. We will temporarily reposition in Iraq, pursuant to bringing the troops home. And so it's just one part of a continuing phase, but eventually those troops are going to come home.
So they are coming home?
They will come.
None will stay in Syria?
Well, right now the president has authorized that some would stay in the southern part of Syria and Tanf. And we are looking maybe keeping some additional forces to ensure that we deny ISIS and others access to these key oil fields also in the middle part of the country, if you will. But that needs to be worked out in time. The president hasn't approved that yet. I need to take him options sometime here soon. But the bulk of the force would reposition into Iraq and then eventually go home.
So none of this is clear, first and foremost, and those who might stay might be away from that border, away from the bulk of the ISIS trouble, and securing oil fields from who? Well,
I don't talk about securing oil fields as much as I talk about denying ISIS access to the oil fields so that they can't have revenue to continue their bad behavior. And with regard to the deployment, what I try and do, what my aim is to keep my options open, really keep the president's options open, so as events change on the ground, whether it's up in northeast Syria or other parts, we have the flexibility to respond to the president's direction.
How are you going to have the flexibility to respond to a resurgence of ISIS? And as you know, that is a big concern from inside the military, from amongst your allies, from many in the president's party back in the United States, and analysts and politicians all over the world. All of these years that you've managed to deny them the ability to pose a serious threat, they are now open for business again, and people are very, very concerned. In fact, General Petraeus has said this does not end an endless war, it probably prolongs it, because this gives ISIS an opportunity for a resurgence. This is not a strategic success.
Well, let's look at the facts on the ground. Based on the intelligence we have, the reporting we have, of the 11,000 or so detainees that were in prisons in northeast Syria, we've only had reports of a little bit more than 100 that have escaped. The SDF, and we remain in contact with them, are maintaining the guards over top the prisons they have control of. So right now we have not seen this big prison break that we all expected. So that's the good news piece. And then with regard to the other part, I'll be meeting with my allies, the United States allies, in Brussels in the coming days. We're going to have a specific session on what do we do with the Defeat ISIS campaign now that's in a new phase to ensure that we can maintain pressure on ISIS so that it doesn't resurge.
Golly, Secretary, in a new phase, some would say you have, I don't know, wantonly or willingly ended the success on ISIS. You heard what General Petraeus just said. It's not really a new phase. I mean, the metrics are not about territory, are they? They're about resurgence, regrouping, the ability to do so. And even before this withdrawal of U.S. forces, many in your military and elsewhere were watching a resurgence and watching cells come together.
I wouldn't classify it as a resurgent. I had not. What I would say is this, keep in mind why we partnered with the SDF originally going back to 2014. It was to defeat ISIS. And we ended up destroying the physical caliphate of ISIS as of March this year. And the task then is to make sure we maintain the enduring defeat. And part and parcel of that is making sure that local security, et cetera, can handle that. So, yes, we are in a new phase of the Defeat ISIS campaign. It's to maintain that defeat, maintain that destruction.
I'm still confused. The local forces who are making sure that that happened were the SDF, and those are the forces who, by withdrawing, you have allowed to be victims and targets of the Turkish offensive, which is precisely designed to get them out of the way of the area that you've been stabilizing.
The SDF are still in control of the prisons that are under their control. The Turks have told us they've taken control of the prisons under which they now have responsibility. And our mission in that area was to train, advise, and assist. We weren't guarding prisons. up there in that part of the world.
I mean, as you know, it's not just about prisons, it's about fighting. And the Kurds were your real on-the-ground fighting force. Tragically, about 8 American lives were lost during the fight for ISIS, but more than 11,000 Kurdish lives were lost.
That's right. And we were their enablers, and we were their air force. So we had mutual interest. The mutual interest was destroying the physical caliphate of ISIS.
Correct. And make sure that ISIS doesn't come back as a fighting force, which people are worried that they will right now, including members of the Pentagon.
And we're all focused on that, is to make sure we understand as we enter this new phase, how do we continue that enduring defeat of ISIS?
I'm having trouble with the word enduring, but let me ask you first. You say you're going to NATO to talk to allies.
Sure.
Allies are actually quite shocked, and I'd be interested to know what they say to you, because those were your allies, the Kurdish forces on the ground, and they right now feel utterly betrayed. You've seen these terrible, tragic pictures. I'm sure no Secretary of Defense wants to see their allies throwing rocks and rotten fruit at retreating American forces, calling them liars and saying that they've betrayed them. I wonder how do you feel when you see that?
Well, here is what the allies have said, publicly and privately. We all condemn what President Erdogan of Turkey has done. We all opposed it. That is, this irresponsible incursion into northern Syria that has upset what had been happening on the ground successfully. And so everybody opposes that. We're going to talk specifically about that as well in the context of what's next with regard to defeat ISIS. So that's, I think, where we will begin at that point right there.
I guess I'm asking you, how does it feel to see your allies react to what they believe is a betrayal, throwing rotten fruit at you? How do you react to Russian forces, and we have pictures of them, marching nonchalantly into the abandoned U.S. bases?
So I think you have to go back to the original reason why we partnered with the SDF. This is going back to the Obama administration, carried through into the Trump administration. The defeat of ISIS, which resulted in the physical destruction of the caliphate. We didn't sign up to fight a war to defend the Kurds against a long-standing NATO ally, and we certainly didn't sign up to help them establish an autonomous Kurdish state. That was the conflict that the Turks put us in between. An advancing Turkish army opposed by the Kurds, or at least elements of the SDF, and at the same time you had Syrian and Russian forces moving in. That's not the position which we want our young American service members to be in.
There's so many bits and bobs to ask you about, but first and foremost, the 120-hour cessation of hostilities, not a ceasefire, obviously, as you know better than I do. It's not a formal ceasefire, it's a pause. And the president of Turkey has said that they're going to wait and see. I'm just going to play this little soundbite.
But if these promises are not realized, as soon as the 120 hours are over, our operation of Peace Spring will continue more rapidly than before.
And he has actually said, furthermore, we will start where we left off and continue to crush the terrorists' head. Now, he's talking about the SDF, the Kurds. What do you make of that?
Well, again, we would call upon the President Erdogan to be more responsible, to act prudently. What we've seen with the reporting I've heard in the last, at least previous 24 hours, is that the ceasefire is largely holding. There is some skirmishing here and there.
But it expires tonight.
It does. But we're getting reports that the SDF are making good faith efforts to withdraw from the area in time. And I think if they need a little bit more time, they should be giving a little bit more time. I think at the end of the day, what we've called upon is for there to be a ceasefire and that we reach a political agreement, a settlement between the parties that can be enduring.
Can I just read you a couple of things? And I ask you, as a military man, you're a fighting soldier. You've done this for your country and actually to protect Saudi Arabia from the invasion of Saddam Hussein, potentially, and that was in nearly 30 years ago. There are a lot of U.S. forces, your brave special forces, who are telling even Fox News, that's an ally of President Trump's, we're not talking about anybody else, Fox News, that they feel ashamed, that they have felt really wounded to see their allies who they fought alongside with betrayed in this way. We see an army captain who's talked to the New York Times, and basically he said, I joined the army to prevent genocide, not to pave the way for it. We've even seen the head of the Senate Republicans, the Senate majority, to Mitch McConnell, write a very, very pointed op-ed in which he said The combination of a U.S. pullback and the escalating Turkish-Kurdish hostilities is creating a strategic nightmare for our country. Even the 5-day ceasefire announced Thursday holds. If it does, events of the past week have set back the United States campaign against the Islamic State and other terrorists. Unless halted, our retreat, he calls it a retreat, will invite the brutal Assad regime in Syria and its Iran backers to expand their influence. And we're ignoring Russia's efforts to leverage its increasing dominant position in Syria to amass power and influence throughout the Middle East and beyond. As Secretary of Defense of the United States, how do you respond to that?
Look, I understand the sentiments of the soldiers on the ground who have fought side by side with the Kurds. The Kurds have been our good partners in the defeat ISIS. There's a certain bond that happens in combat when you're with fellow soldiers of any country. As you said, I experienced it during my time here in the Gulf War. I understand that. But at the end of the day, when you get back up to the 30,000-foot level, the strategic level, you got to ask ourselves, at the time that President Erdogan decided to cross that border very clearly, that he was going to make that move, I had a responsibility to make sure that our soldiers weren't put in harm's way, trapped between a 15,000-man-plus army and SDF forces from the south, and eventually Russians and Syrians. So I took, with the recommendation of the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, we recommended that those troops be withdrawn, and eventually the rest of the forces be withdrawn. I think the broader strategic context is this. Look, it's no surprise that President Trump said coming into office, as he campaigned, that he wanted to bring American soldiers, service members home as much as he can and to end the endless wars, in his words. And so this is part and parcel of that, and it should come at no surprise to anybody.